So welcome everybody. I'm Jodie. If you don't know me, I'm marketing manager at Finite. If you're a Finite member, welcome back to another webinar. If you're not a Finite member, then welcome. We are the private global community for B2B marketers in technology and SaaS companies. So today, we are talking about how to prove the value of the commercial value, of B2B content, which I know is something that we all struggle with and is so important for getting exec buy-in, support, budget for your content programs, and also just generally knowing how your content is impacting revenue. So we're joined by some fabulous analytics experts today. They've worked with some big old companies sorting out their analytics teams and processes like Aon, Invesco, etc. But I think I'll let them introduce themselves as well because they know the ins and outs. So Phil's going to present. Thanks for that, Phil. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Jodie, and thanks everyone for having us here today. It's our plan of what we wanted to talk to you about is a common problem that we get asked to solve by our clients, and that problem, as Jodie alluded to, is how to show the value of content. And by the value, we're talking about a real value that your CFO. In terms of the CFO would want you to talk about value, and why is that important is generally because it directly supports justifications for creating more content, or in some cases obviously for creating less content of certain types as well. So yeah, we'll talk about the contributing factors to the problem and propose a solution that we have worked with for our clients, and just show you what we do for them. Firstly, though, introductions. Myself, I'm Phil, and I've been working in marketing for what I calculated when putting this together was about half of my life, and not being in my 20s anymore. That's actually turns out to be quite a long time. So yeah, you could say I've got a fair bit of experience, and I've not always worked in analytics. So I've worked across the full marketing mix in-house. So I've sat on your side of these, and I've sat on the agency side as well, which has sort of led me to where I am today. And that is in my current position, leading the analytics department at Clarity. Clarity are an integrated marketing agency, and as a department, we're tasked with helping clients make better decisions through their use of data, and that could be, just things like this, showing the value, and it could be making sure data is accurate and everything like that. Also joining me today is Jordan, who I'll just hand over to to introduce himself.
Yeah, so hi everyone. I'm Jordan, obviously. Unfortunately, I'm no longer in my 20s either. But I reckon I got a fair few years until I catch up with Phil yet, so that's the main thing. So I've been working with Phil in the analytics department here at Clarity for the last few years, and I look after the technical side of the department. So my today involves kind of implementing tracking solutions, data warehousing and engineering, and some data visualization as well. Before that, I was an SEO, and before that, I was a web developer. So that kind of marketing and technical background has kind of naturally led me into this technical marketing role that I'm in today.
Cool, thanks, Jordan. So diving straight in now, then, the problem of content measurement is actually something that we might refer to as the CFO problem. And that's not to say your CFO is a problem, but CFOs invariably see the value of marketing defined explicitly by the amount of revenue the activity generated. Now, that's fundamentally a good thing. It's not something that we would ever argue against, and that's what we do for our clients. But as marketers, we know, and that activity that generates revenue doesn't always do so directly. So, and what I mean by that is a view of a web page, of a blog post, insights content. It doesn't always result in the next click being a form submit or a purchase. And in a lead gen context, tying revenue back to a content view is challenging. It's not impossible, because that's what we're going to solve for you today, in part. But yeah, this is where we come back to calling it the CFO problem. Is CFOs love PPC because it's money in, money out. It's very easy to calculate the return. And through this lens, content can look like it's not working, or that we can't explain the value of it. And that makes it very hard to justify the activity, increasing the activity, or justifying the investment in it, even though we actually know that the content is contributing. So how do we solve this problem? How can we show that the value of content in a way that the CFO will listen to? Quickly, referring to Google Analytics, because it's what's is probably the most common web tracking platform. And Google Analytics is great for showing content performance at a session level, knowing which content is bringing users into the site, what content is receiving the most views, and if you're lucky enough that conversions happen on the same session as the content was viewed, then Google Analytics will tell you which content is best at converting. But as I'm sure you're all aware, Google Analytics can't do is tell you what content is driving conversions when the conversion and the content views don't happen in the same session. So you've got first session, second session, and so on. It also can't help you when the final sale happens offline. So what happens during your sales funnel once a user's completed a form on your site, and then essentially their data then is in the CRM, and that's where the activity happens. And these are two very typical scenarios in B2B markets. And to a smaller extent, the first session, second session aspect of this is also a problem for e-commerce sites. So what that means is, to solve this CFO problem, we need to be able to show the value of content in terms of CFO uses, and that means real business metrics, and ultimately that means dollars or pounds. And while content performance measured by traffic it drives, pages within a session, page views within a session, and engagement, they're important, useful metrics. They're not what we would define as real business metrics. So then how do we actually measure content by this real business metric of dollars? And as the previous slide alluded to, ultimately this boils down to user journeys. And to show the value of content, we must look across the full user journey, and all content touch points. And so therefore, ultimately, we're moving away from this sort of single session model. And also, again, we talked about CRMs, so we must also bring that CRM data in, and that's because that's where the sales revenue is contained, and we need to be able to tie that back to the site visits and the actions that the user took there, and the content that they viewed. So there are a couple of content measurement techniques that we use to show the value in this CFO friendly terms, but the most important one, and the one that we're going to talk about today, is something that we've maybe unoriginally named content value, and the output of that is a content value chart, which looks like this. It's a very simple chart. It looks incredibly underwhelming at face value, and so let's get into the details of what this is and what it allows you to do. The ultimate objective of this measure, the content value measure, is to provide a way of assigning that dollar value to each piece of content without the constraints of a session. So we achieve this by working backwards from a conversion. and the conversion can be any objective. So, for example, I've talked about CRMs. If you don't have a CRM, so you don't have your sales funnel is not necessarily digital. It can be an action on your website, such as a form submit. But really, yeah, we're going to talk about it being that final sale at the moment. So we work backwards from there, and we need to identify every user that completed that conversion or became a customer. Then what we do is we take an individual user and we look across that user's entire history of their visits to the website, and then we produce a list of the content that they viewed. And once we have that list, the next step is to apply a value to this content for this single user. Just talking about a single user here at the moment. So we need to apply a value to the content that they viewed, and that needs to be proportionate of the value of the conversion or the sale. So what essentially that it's quite a simple bit of maths. We are taking the value of the transaction and dividing that by the page views. To get that value, this is where Web Analytics runs into a problem. It doesn't have that final sales value, so this is where we do need to bring in our CRM data and join it together with our Web Analytics. I'm not going to talk about the details of how that is done. Jordan will touch on that in a little bit. So for now, let's just assume that the problem is solved and that we have the value of conversions readily available. So then, as I said, what we do is we take that conversion value, and in this example, we're talking about one user, they converted, and that and the value of their sale was $100. And then we simply divide that by the pages that they viewed, and then keep the math simple. In this scenario, we're saying that they viewed 10 pages. Therefore, each piece of content is worth $10. Likewise, if that user had viewed 2 pages, then each piece of content that they viewed was worth $50. So once we've done that for a single user, you end up with a data set that looks a little bit like this, which is essentially a list of pages, pieces of content on the site, and it has a value. So we said that they viewed 5 pages, so we should label those A to E, and as for the example, and each one now has a value of $20. And as you can see, we now have a relative measure of content value for this user's journey. Putting in a second user here, you can see that this user only views 2 pieces of content, but if they completed the same $100 value of conversion, each of the pages that they viewed get half of that, so they're worth $50 each. Now, what we do is we scale this up and repeat the process for all users that completed our conversion objective. That gives us a complete data set for all pieces of content on our site, and with the value assigned to each piece of content being proportional to the contribution each made to that conversion. So once we've done that across our entire data set, and in this example, our entire data set of 2 users, we combine that together, gives us the final page value. And as you can see, there are 2 pages which are clearly more valuable in the conversion journey. So page A and page D, they've got a value of $70, whereas the other pages have only got a value of $20. Now, yes, this is 2 users, but it does scale. Is obviously a very simple solution. It scales, it works whether you've got 2, 20 or 20 million users, and it doesn't matter how many conversions that they've taken, and what the value of those is. All that changes is the numbers, essentially. The numbers get larger, there's more pages, but it scales infinitely, essentially. So if we sort of recap back to the CFO problem, which was the need to show the dollar value of content, this simple output solves that problem. We now have the relative value of each piece of content, and that's its relative contribution to the final sale. So if you wanted to put this in front of the CFO, you do now have an ROI for each piece of content. Put a big however in here, and it's not particularly actionable. It's going to answer that question if someone was to ask you, what is the ROI here? You can put a number in front of them, but what's useful for planning? How do we make this more useful? To make it more useful for planning and your content strategy work, we need to add in an additional metric, and in this case we add in page views, and that's the total number of views each piece of content received. Then once we have that, we can start plotting it into the charts that we saw earlier. The content's value that we calculated from the journey is plotted on the vertical axis, and the number of views that the content received is plotted horizontally. So every dot on the chart is representing a piece of content, and we can actually instantly see whether each piece of content is receiving more views or fewer views than any other piece of content, and whether it's driving more value or less value than any other piece of content. Now, to help us analyze this and know what actions to take, we can divide the chart into quadrants. Content in the bottom left is of low value. It's not being viewed many times, and it's not contributing very much to conversions. So content here, it could become more valuable if it was viewed more. So the action here for content in the bottom left is to drive more traffic to it and see if it moves upwards or to the right, or ideally it's going to do both. So content in that bottom right, content in the bottom right has many views, but it's not actually, but the users which are viewing it aren't converting. It's not contributing to many conversions, meaning that this content is of low value and isn't being it's of low value, but it's not being held back by a lack of traffic. It's getting some of the most traffic. It's just not working on the conversions. So the answer here is we shouldn't really be making any more of this content as it's not performing. You might also want to consider whether that content should be replaced, or can it be improved. Then upper left quadrant, this is my favorite quadrant because it's where the opportunity lies. It's the content which is some of the most valuable in the conversion journey, even though it has relatively low traffic. So the opportunity there is through driving more traffic to this content, and then seeing what happens. Hopefully, it stays as high value content and it just moves to the top right quadrant, and that top right quadrant is traffic, is the pages which have the most value and they have the most traffic. So ultimately, that is where you want every piece of content to be ending up. So really, we label that last quadrant there as maintain. So you just need to keep an eye on it, check that it's keeping its high traffic volume, and checking that when if its traffic drops, or you can alter that and drive more traffic to it, and over time you want to check that it's not actually dropping off in terms of how many conversions it's contributing to. So this demonstrates the method of assigning value to content that we've found most successful with our clients, because not only does it answer that question, the CFO question again of what is the value of content, but also it allows you to know what actions to take to increase the value of any individual piece of content. The real beauty of this method is its simplicity, and that's why our clients have had success with it. They find it very easy to incorporate this and this sort of particular chart here into their content teams, so it doesn't take an analyst to be able to to have to report on it. Anybody can access it and look at a piece of content and say, oh, was this piece of content working or not, which means during content planning sessions it just becomes a tool which you can have a conversation around. So it's very simple, answers the question of the content of the ROI of content. There's one aspect of it that is maybe a little caveat that it doesn't account for recency. And in the analysis of content, recency is important because has that content been around long enough to have had an impact? Has it been around long enough to have contributed to many conversions? So older content has an advantage by nature of just being around and being viewed more. And we'll talk about recency a little bit more in a minute and how to factor that in. But first of all, I'm going to just hand over to Jordan, who's just going to talk a little bit about the technical requirements for how to use this content value measure.
Cool. Yeah. Cheers, Phil. So yeah, how do we make this a reality? How can we end up with a reporting table that powers these visualizations? So fundamentally, we need to be able to put a dollar cost on content performance. And to do that, we need to be able to join our CRM data, so our revenue data, to our web traffic data. And to join any data set, you need a shared common key. So for this example, I'll use Google Analytics, but the same kind of principles apply to other analytic tools as well. So with Google Analytics, they provide us with a key we can utilize out of the box. So that is the client ID. So the client ID is a unique identifier that Google Analytics assigns to your browser or device when you first visit a website, and that is stored as a first-party cookie. In theory, this client ID would remain persistent on that device for up to 2 years. And I say in theory because due to the ever-changing privacy landscape, more and more browsers are limiting this cookie's lifetime. So in reality, this is a lot shorter, but fundamentally, this is Google Analytics' method of identifying those users. So to establish this as our shared common key, we need to integrate this into our CRM. And the idea here is to send that user's client ID when they submit a form on your website. So you're thereby passing that value into your CRM system. So the specifics here kind of vary a little bit depending on your CRM and the analytics tools that you use, but generally you'll need to create a hidden field in your form. So if you're using HubSpot, for example, you'd go into the back end of HubSpot and add a hidden field designed specifically to receive that client ID. And then you need to obtain that client ID and update that hidden field accordingly. So there are a few methods of doing this, and it kind of depend on how your tracking is implemented, but essentially it'll involve a piece of code that would extract that client ID value from the cookie, and then you would pass that into the hidden field so it's available on form submit. So once that client ID starts populating in your CRM, how can we go about joining these data sets? Well, there are a couple of ways of doing this, and in my opinion, there is a right way and a wrong way. So I'll spare you all the technical details of the wrong way, but essentially you can send offline events to Google Analytics. So for example, if an opportunity became a sale in your CRM, you can send this as an event to Google Analytics server representing this change. Now, I talked about client ID a second ago, but with this method, you need to collect some additional data points and send some additional data points to Google Analytics to be able to stitch these to a user or a session. The issue with pushing offline events into Google Analytics is that firstly, even if you had all the correct data points and you were able to tie that offline event back to a session, you would still need to send that offline event to Google Analytics within 72 hours of the original session. So when that form submission originally happened. Obviously in B2B, sales life cycles are usually a lot longer than this. So what would happen if you sent an event past that time period? Google Analytics would essentially just create a new unattributed session. So the impact of this, it would start inflating your session numbers, as well as causing you all sorts of headaches when it comes to attribution. Secondly, and this is my opinion, you can use the tool as you like, but Google Analytics isn't supposed to be an exact representation of all of your data. Yeah, it's great at kind of telling you how well your marketing campaigns are doing based on the traffic to your site. but kind of adding these offline events creates a lot of noise to the data set. And kind of touching back on what I've just said there about sending those events, past that 72-hour period, they could potentially be isolated from the rest of the data anyway, so they're unusable. So therefore, the best approach would be to join the data sets outside of Google Analytics. And the answer to that is BigQuery. So despite all of GA4's quirks, it does have a really nice feature where you can export all of your data into BigQuery, which is a data warehouse. Historically, this feature was only available to paying customers in Universal Analytics, but they've opened this up to make it available to all users in GA4. Naturally, Google only kind of allows you to export to BigQuery. So if you're using a different data warehouse, you'll need to go via BigQuery to get it into there. But for anyone using Google Analytics, I would recommend doing it regardless of having that raw data is invaluable. Google Analytics they have sort of data retention settings. So what I mean by that is after a certain period in time, Google will start removing some of your data from their servers. They have, to be fair, recently extended these retention periods, but having that data in BigQuery kind of allows you to bypass these entirely as you own all of that data. There is one caveat when it comes to the export, is that you cannot backfill data into BigQuery. So it will only start populating from the day you create that initial connection. So if you do use Google Analytics and you haven't done it yet, it's wise that you do this as soon as possible, so you're building up that historical data. So coming back to join your CRM data with your web analytics data. So now you've got your Google Analytics data in your data warehouse. You also need to get your CRM data into the warehouse too. So there are several ways of doing this. So you could have a developer build a custom pipeline. You could leverage a third-party tool, such as Fivetran, obviously at a cost, which would automate this for you. Or you can go more of a simplistic approach by kind of uploading data via spreadsheets manually. So once you have both of those data sets in your warehouse, you can begin modeling that data to suit your reporting needs. So to bring it back to context of assigning a dollar value to a piece of content, we could start by creating a table from the Google Analytics data. So in the most simplistic form, we could have the client ID, and then we can pull the relevant page views that happened before that form submit. And then next, from our CRM data, we could have the client ID and the associated sales revenue. And then by joining these tables on the client ID, we're essentially passing that revenue data, or we can integrate that revenue data into our web analytics data. And then we can distribute that revenue across our page views and perform some aggregations, which will essentially give us a reporting table where we have a value for a piece of content. And that will allow us to power those visualizations that Phil shared earlier on.
Thanks, Gordon. I think one of the takeaways from that is actually about the BigQuery exports, and yeah, just to reiterate what Jordan said, if you're using Google Analytics, it's something which you should turn on today, even if you're not actually going to make use of the data in BigQuery for a while. It's one of those things that if you do it in 6 months when you want to start using it, you wish you'd done it 6 months ago, because then you'd had 6 months worth of extra data. So as touched on before Jordan talks about the technical side, I mentioned recency, and that needs to be considered when doing any analysis of content performance, not just specifically to the methods that we showed of measuring content value here. Now, into our calculation of content value, we could add into that a weighting of recency and weight the value by how recent or how old that piece of content is. However, it suddenly then becomes quite a complex calculation. It changes the content value metric from something very simple to understand into something which has some nuance to it. And generally with analytics, we've found simplicity is the key. because you need analytics to be adopted, not just by analysts, essentially. So therefore, our recommendation is actually to use recency as a secondary metric, as standalone, and use that just to validate the insights that you get from the content value reporting. And then you take your insights and then you just validate that before taking any action. So, for example, during the quadrant analysis that we went through on the content value chart, you're getting your insights from there, you're planning your actions for a specific piece of content, and then you might want to just check the recency of publication, because it might be a piece of content which has got a low view count, and then you might find that it's simply because it was published a week ago, and therefore it really wouldn't be fair to say it is not performing well. It's just not been around for long enough. And then the opposite can be true as well. Another piece of content might have been published 6 months or 12 months ago, and that's also comparatively low on views. But in that scenario, we know recency is not a factor here, and therefore it's struggling for some other reason. So yeah, so we just bring recency in, and just bring it in as a simple, it's just a single metric. How long ago was this piece of content published? So to give a little bit of summary, I give you some the takeaways that we want to impart. The first one being the way to show content value, in terms of that the CFO understands. So it really has to be dollars. That's like really only way of showing showing its value and showing the return on it and justifying creating more content. To do this, content needs to be analysed in context of the user and not a single session. And trying to do it around a single session, you'll be stuck with engagement rates, which are or number of page views. Things which are good metrics, but they're not real business metrics. To achieve this, it can be done via the GA4 export to BigQuery. And as Jordan said, this is a free feature in GA4. Previously, it came with a price tag of around $100,000 or more. And yeah, so it's great. It's definitely from our opinion, it's probably the best thing that came out of GA4. So to tie dollar value to content views, we also need to combine CRM data if that's where your record of sales and transactions lives. And again, due to GA4 and the BigQuery exports, this can now be possible just by pushing your CRM data to BigQuery as well. And then the final two parts are plotting content value alongside page views. That's what provides this nice simple matrix for defining what actions to take, but always validate the insights from the content value analysis against recency of publishing. Cool. So hopefully that's in a short session explained how we at Clarity are working with our clients to help them solve that problem of showing content value. And like I said at the beginning, there are other ways of doing it as well. We do use other metrics as alongside these, but this is the one which is sort of seen as the most important one, because it gives you that nice simple number that you can put in front of the C-suite or whoever it may be, but the budgets need to be justified too. But it also gives you that nice actionable outcome as well of how to drive more value from your content. So I think we're just now going to hand over to see if there's any questions.
Yeah, thanks, Phil. And just a reminder, we do have a question, to use the Q&A function in the activities section of Google Meet down on the left, on the bottom right. This is a question from Anonymous. Thank you very much. Do you have any examples of work you've done with clients to measure the value of content? So yeah, any kind of examples of your client work that you can draw on?
Yes. I mean, a lot of the time we actually hand this over to content teams. So we will build this infrastructure for them, like I said, and that was part of the reason of making it so simple. is so that we can hand it over to the content team and at our client's content team, and they can use it for planning. So we quite often, we'll take this chart and we'll turn it into a dashboard for whatever dashboard platform the client uses, so that they can access it themselves. It then becomes a tool which is used, and in some cases just been used for ongoing over the years to help with the planning.
Okay.
If you're specifically asking, I'm trying to avoid actually using specific client names, if that's, because then we could talk more about what we've done, if that was the question.
Sure. That's great. We'll give it a little bit longer for a question. In the meantime, I just have a quick question. Is this only measuring content on your own site, or can it measure kind of third-party content as well?
Yeah, this would be content on your own site, because you need that GA data, or Adobe Analytics if that's the tool you're using, or any other analytics tools. Apparently there are others, but those are the main ones. So yeah, you need that. So really, it is content on your own sites. If you wanted to be able to see the value of content on other sites, you'd have to. Yeah, you're not really going to get any hard numbers for that. So you'd have to look at other methods of doing it.
Okay. Cool. I didn't know if there was any tagging or anything you could do, but great. It doesn't look like anyone has any other questions. Must mean you did a really great job and were very good at explaining all the details. So thank you so much on behalf of all the viewers and myself for joining us today. It was a really great session. And thank you to everyone who joined. It was lovely to have you here, and I hope you can join for the next one. I will email you a copy of this recording and maybe a summary blog that you can read if you need to come back to any of the information.